Thank you. And thank you for having me. And this is going to be a bit of a departure, but you'll see the pragmatism sort of coming back at the end. So I'll just launch right in. Feel free to interrupt me if there's anything that's not clear. So humanism, that is, in humanism, the primary object is the human mosaic. So the totality of local matters, a particular fact arranged in a system of external relations. The ontological clarity of the human mosaic is supposed to be unassailable. And the thought was that if we could show that the noisy embellishments that science adds, so the laws, the chances, causes, capacities, all of those sort of modalized structures that impute apparently necessary connections among the local matters of particular facts, were just signposts. Oh, sorry. My screen isn't advancing. There we go. We're just signposts and useful summaries of distributed structures in the mosaic, designed to aid limited creatures in making their way about the world. We would have a clean metaphysics that rooted everything in local matters of particular fact. So I've become worried about whether the concept of the human mosaic is really healthy. And the problem is not the local matters of particular fact. The problem is that the human mosaic is defined as the totality of local matters of particular fact, and that laws and chances are yoked to specifically global features of that totality. So it matters very much that there is a well-defined totality there, because if the totality is not well-defined, neither are the laws and chances. So the first part of the paper is just going to be sort of raising problems and trying to understand the nature of the difficulties. And that's really going to be the heart of the paper. I'm going to wind my way through them, saying why I think that certain simple proposed remedies won't work. Then I'll settle on what I think the right treatment is. And then I'm going to turn to humanism and say why I think all of this spells trouble for humanism. Although, I mean, I should say my heart is very much with humanism, and I'm sort of, this is very much kind of looking for solutions to what seems to me now to be a bit of a problem. And then I'm going to try to be fairly quick and leave lots of time to for discussion. So I'll do my best to sort of set up the difficulty so that we can talk about it. So at first, the notion of totality, of course, it seems entirely mundane. So if you think about the eggs in a basket, for example, we all know what it means for this egg to be in the basket, and this one to be in the basket, and this one not to be in the basket. We all know that is to say what it is for a particular egg to be in the basket or not in the basket. And we all know what it means to say that there's a total of 6 eggs in the basket. That means that there are 6 eggs in the basket and no more. We can make easy sense of the total number of eggs in the basket, or the total number of Republicans in Congress, or the total number of people in China, because those are domains whose boundaries are given. When the boundaries of a domain are given, there is something definite that counts as making a complete survey of its contents. Things are a little different when we are working in an indefinitely extendable domain. So a domain is indefinitely extendable if, no matter how large it is, it can always be extended. A domain like this has no intrinsic maxima. There's nothing that counts as having made a complete survey of its contents. A totality fact is established when we can say, of course, in general, that there are this many things and no more. But in an indefinitely extendable domain, there is no point at which we're in a position to say, and no more. If the universe is indefinitely extendable, that is, if no matter how big it is, it can be extended further, then totality facts pertaining to the universe fall into this category. Now, there are 2 places in philosophy where questions about the status of these kinds of facts arose. So they arose in logic in connection with negative existentials and unrestricted quantification. They arose in metaphysics in connection with truth maker and grounding and supervenience. Sorry. So in logical terms, claims about totality are connected to universal quantification because the domain of a universally quantified sentence is totality. The quantifier in a claim like all swans are white ranges over everything, not everything in subspecified class, not everything in some restricted domain, but absolutely everything. And universally quantified sentences are, of course, logically equivalent to negative existentials. To say that all swans are white is to say that there is no swan that is not white. So these three things, claims about totality, universally quantified sentences, and negative existentials, are largely interchangeable. So reasons for worrying about one are reasons for worrying about another. Now, in first order logic, of course, we're always just given a domain, a universe of discourse. That's the first thing you do. You say, here are all of the things. And then we go on to associate truth conditions with the quantifiers. So we say, here is the universe of discourse. We explicitly specify all of the things that there are. And that specification is what creates an inferential bridge between a set of atomic facts, a set of facts of the form A is B, A is P, B is P, C is P, and some universal quantification for all X. X is P. But that inferential bridge is created by the specification of the domain. Those objects are perfectly compatible, that is A being P, B being P, C being P, are perfectly compatible in logical terms with the existence of another object D that is not P. So there's no rule of logic that will take you from a collection of atomic facts to a negative existential. What it means for these to be atomic facts is that they're logically and metaphysically unconnected to one another, right? Existentially unconnected to one another. For that reason, there's no rule of logic that will take you from a collection of atomic facts in an unrestricted domain to a totality fact or to a universal quantification. The same sort of difficulty comes up in metaphysics. So for principles in general that relate a base ontology to an ontology of higher level objects. So I'm not endorsing any of these principles. I'm just showing you how, when you're in that sort of on that field, you're going to run into the same sort of problem with totality facts. So the central principle of the problems in metaphysics literature would be these: truth maker principle, a collection of entities makes a proposition true if and only if their existence necessitates its truth. Grounding for any time T and world W. If P is grounded in C at T, then P is necessitated by C. Human supervenience, if W and W star are two worlds that are duplicates with respect to fundamental facts that obtain in W and W star, then they're duplicates with respect to all facts, simplicity. So each of these principles runs into trouble with totality facts for something very like the reason that we saw in for negative existentials and universal quantification. So consider a world, W, in which there's a total of 2 billion people. What makes it true that there is a total of 2 billion people? What grounds the number of people in W? What does it supervene on? Well, not the people in W. There's nothing about those people that keeps them from being part of a world with more people. And it doesn't help to look more widely in W, because you could take W with all of its people and all of their relations to one another and everything else intrinsically fixed about that world and embed it in a world with more people. That also means that whatever makes it true that there's 2 billion people in W, it's not anything in W. And indeed, it also means that it also means that the total number of people in W doesn't supervene on the facts about the people in W, or indeed anything internal to W at all. The same goes for the total number of particles, the total energy, or the total anything in the world. Unrestricted totality facts in general are not, according to these principles at least, grounded by anything in our world. They're not made true by anything in our world, and they don't supervene on anything in our world. They're true of our world, but they're not made true by anything in it. So here again, we encounter the problems. So the tendency in the metaphysics literature has been to just treat totality facts as primitive. So Armstrong did it, Lewis, I think, did it. The universe just has some particular size, definite size, or some particular energy. It's a primitive fact over and above all of the local matters of particular fact. And it provides truth conditions for universal generalizations, negative existentials, and totality claims of all kinds. So this seems like the simplest and the cleanest solution. There are reasons, though, I think that it can't be right, or it can't be right at least for the purposes that I'm interested in. So if we just look at simple cases of restricted totalities, that is, totalities in some specified domain, imposing a totality fact as a primitive addition induces connections between the elements in the domain that are clearly not intrinsic to it. So imagine I'm teaching a class. Any first-year student can enroll. They make their decisions independently. Each has their own list of requirements and preferences. The total number in that case is a tally of the outcome of all of their decisions. If, as a matter of fact, 4 enroll overall, it's like a sad truth about some of my classes, then we know that, for example, if John, Janet, Ezra, and Liz are enrolled, then Jaime is not enrolled. But that doesn't mean that John, Janet, Ezra, and Liz's enrollment keep Jaime from enrolling. In fact, there's no connection at all by stipulation between their enrollment and his. And when you think about it this way, we could induce almost any connection by giving the right sort of auxiliary information in conjunction with the total number that enroll. If we listed everybody's, for example, if we listed everybody's decision except John, Janet, Ezra, and Liz's, for example, then it would seem, given the total, since we know 4 enrolled, that they have to enroll. Or we fix everybody else's decision except for Liz and Jaime's, and then it seems like Jaime's decision not to enroll forces Liz to, thereby reversing the order of determination that we described in the beginning. Okay. The situation is sort of like this. Suppose I give you a string of 100 arbitrary integers. Okay, so positive and negative whole numbers. The total, the sum of the numbers in the string, is determined collectively by the values of each of the members of the string. Each one of those adds some information about the total, and the total is determined collectively by all of them. But if I give you 98 numbers, 98 of the numbers, right, in conjunction with the total, I induce a connection between the last two. Why? Because the 99th will determine the value, when the total is given, will determine the value of the 100th. And indeed, that's true of any 2 numbers that I choose. And the direction of determination will depend on the order in which the last 2 are given. And you can play around with this, right? When you impose the totality as an independent, the total number as an independent primitive conjunction, it's going to induce these funny connections between the local matters of particular fact. So given the total, for example, probabilities for high numbers later in the string will decrease if I give high numbers, if high numbers are revealed early on. If low numbers are revealed early on, so if I'm revealing numbers 1 by 1, then your probabilities for higher numbers later will increase, and so on. What's going on here is that the sum, in fact, is not a separate primitive fact. It's determined collectively by the numbers in the string. And for that reason, it contains a little bit of information about each of them, though, of course, the order of determination goes from the numbers in the string to the total. Okay? Think of the numbers in the string as opportunities to contribute to the total. And in this case, of course, the totals can be positive, negative, or null. Okay? Once all of the numbers are revealed, the total is redundant. But if we've only revealed some of the numbers, the total will contain information about the unrevealed remainder. The more information we've already revealed, the more precisely focused the information will be on the unrevealed remainder. And what we're doing by combining the total with different kind of configurations of auxiliary information is just focusing the information that the total contains on different elements in the string. So we're extracting pieces of information that the total contains about different elements in the string. Let's modify the class example in a way that brings in the temporal elements to get a purchase on when the fact about the total number of students that enroll in my class is fixed. So suppose that of the 100 people eligible to enroll, so of the opportunities to contribute to the total, the 4 that do enroll almost immediately, okay? Because the gunners have made up their mind quickly, the rest kind of dilly-dally until the last minute, and each, for his own complicated reasons, each of the remainder decide not to enroll. If the totality fact is a separate primitive fact, then it seems like once the 4 that do enroll have registered, right, the total has been reached and nobody else can. But of course, that's not right. The right thing to say here, and what you're supposed to find these examples plausibly showing, right, is that the total is not a separate fact, nor is it fixed by the decisions only of those who decide to enroll. It's fixed by the choices of each and everyone who could have contributed to that total, negative as well as positive contributions. It's fixed, moreover, when their deliberations have ended, when all of the opportunities to contribute to the total have been exhausted. Then the totality fact has been fixed. Okay? So if you treat the total as a separate fact, or you fix it prematurely before the choices of those who could have contributed sorry, to the total have been resolved, you've implicitly included information about their outcomes. Okay. That's why it seems as though as soon as the total has been reached, everything after that appears fixed. The right thing to say is that totality facts are not fixed at the outset, and they're not fixed independently. They're not primitive facts. Totality facts are fixed by the individual elements in the domain, and they're fixed at the end when the last person has made her choice and there remain no more opportunities to contribute to the total. Okay. So let's apply that. Let's accept that. Let's suppose that we accept that totality facts are not primitive or separate facts, but are rather fixed by the totality of opportunities to contribute to the total. That's clearly right in cases of restricted totalities. And it explains why when you prematurely impose a totality fact, instead of letting things play out and just registering the result or the outcome, you get the appearance that things that manifestly can happen can't. The thing is that when we apply this in an indefinitely extendable domain, it means that totality facts are never fixed. That is, they're fixed at no point in the internal timeline of our world, because the opportunities for contributing to the total are never exhausted. That's what it means to say the world is indefinitely extendable. There always remain opportunities to extend it. Imposing any kind of boundary on an indefinitely extendable domain will be closing off open possibilities, because what indefinite extendability says is that no matter how many of the local matters of particular fact that you've accounted for, you've never exhausted opportunities to contribute. If totality facts are fixed when totality is achieved, then it would seem we would have to say that totality facts in our world are never fixed, because totality is never achieved. There's another problem, okay? And this I'm going to call the master argument. Okay? We can give an argument that any attempt to specify this purported totality, the totality of local matters of particular fact, the totality that's supposed to constitute the human mosaic. Any attempt to give a kind of finite effective procedure for membership in this totality, right, leads to paradox. So imagine a computer program or a Laplacian daemon or some little oracle that will answer any question about what happens at some particular location in the Human Mosaic. So there's an input channel, and there's an output where you submit questions, and they're about local matters of particular fact. And there's an output channel or a screen on which the answers are displayed. Ask it, is the answer that's about to appear on the output channel? No. It can't truthfully answer. You can try to get around this by rephrasing the question, but there will always be a question that you can ask it that it can't answer truthfully. A perfectly fine question about a local matter of particular fact. Okay. So this is completely familiar. It's the Gödelian conclusion applied to the totality of local matters of particular physical fact. It shows that any attempt to give a complete and consistent specification of totality from within the universe is going to carry the seeds of its own demise. So here's where we are. We began with some questions about the metaphysics of totality facts. So the fact that some particular collection of things or some particular collection of events constitutes the totality of what there is. We were asking, what are the truth conditions of such facts? And when and by what are they fixed? By looking at simple cases of restricted totalities, we saw reasons for rejecting the simple tactic of taking totality facts as primitive, because a totality fact includes information about the outcomes of all opportunities to contribute to the total. And imposing it as a kind of boundary condition prejudges some of those outcomes. Analysis of those cases suggested, and this was just the class example and the number example, okay, that the totality fact is determined by outcomes of all opportunities to contribute to the total. And it was fixed when those opportunities have reached resolution. Okay. The problem was that indefinite extendability leaves us without a point at which all opportunities have reached resolution. Now, one reaction to this is just to deny that there is such a thing as the totality of events or the totality of local matters of particular fact. As John Perry says, I can see no reason, empirical or a priori, to assume that there is such a thing as absolute or unrestricted totality. However big a situation we choose, there's always an outside to that situation. And of course, one very good reason for wanting to say such a thing is the one that we've just seen, namely that any attempt to explicitly specify what belongs to totality is subject to paradox. Okay? It does not seem at this point that there is such a well-defined thing as the Human Mosaic. Okay? So with all of this bouncing around your head, in your head, you might be thinking, you should be thinking, that just doesn't seem right. Doesn't cosmology, for example, provide us with perfectly intelligible models of physical totalities? And surely there's just nothing wrong with the idea of a world in which there are exactly n many particles, or a world defined by the Hamiltonian H, or right, some exact solution to the field equations of general relativity. We know how to describe those worlds. We know exactly what they look like. They're mathematically well defined. They have perfectly determinate global properties. Of course, that's right. Nothing that I've said means that we can't introduce explicitly specified models of hypothetical physical totalities and talk about their global properties. Certainly, we can introduce a possible world by saying, there are these particles arranged in this way and no more, right? Or specify a Hamiltonian. Okay? Those totalities are well defined, and facts about their global properties are perfectly determinate because they are fixed by stipulation. Indeed, much of theoretical cosmology nowadays is devoted to the exploration of complete solutions of field equations, which are explicit representations of physical totalities. Okay? As objects of formal exploration, there's nothing wrong with them. It's exactly the same thing as defining all by explicitly introducing a universe of discourse and logic. Okay? The question is rather whether there is a well-defined totality that's picked out by the phrase, the actual totality of physical events. That is, whether that is a condition that picks out a particular set or class of events, whether for any proposed event E, there is a fact about whether or not E belongs to the set of actual events, whether there's a finite effective procedure for explicitly specifying the set of all actual events. Now, the more that you stare at these problems, the more I think they seem connected. Totality facts are facts about the outcomes of all opportunities to contribute to the total. We can see this in the kinds of finite examples that I gave of restricted totalities. If you let those opportunities play out and simply register the result, then the totality fact is redundant. If treated as a separate fact or fixed prematurely, the redundancy will produce illusory necessities of the kind that we saw in the number example and the class example. So given the total, once you fix the values of the first 99 numbers in the 100 number string, revealing the last adds nothing. That's a symptom of redundancy. That's why it looks like it's necessary given the total. Okay, and it can produce interference. Okay? Any attempt to specify what belongs to totality from within the universe, for example, is itself a physical act, so it belongs to the universe. It's going to fall under its own scope, so it's going to be redundant, and it's going to be possible to create a question that creates the kind of logical interference that's characteristic of paradox. What do I mean by logical interference? I mean that, for example, in the case of the computer, that whatever it says is going to be something that renders itself false. So, for example, when you ask, is the answer that's about to appear on the output channel no, however the device answers, it will be saying one thing and doing the opposite. That's what I mean by logical interference. So those are the problems. They have to do with the fact that the totality fact contains information about each and every one of the things that happened. Including it separately is going to create redundancy. Redundancy creates false necessities and also opens the possibility for interference. I'm going to propose a resolution. Generically, let's say, totality facts are fixed by the outcomes of opportunities to contribute to totality. In cases of restricted totalities, we have a well-defined class of opportunities, and the totality facts are fixed when all of those opportunities have been resolved. The problem in an indefinitely extendable setting we saw was that the class is open-ended. So there's no point at which all of the opportunities to contribute to totality have been resolved or accounted for. If, however, the goal is to give truth conditions to claims about totality, to understand what they mean, what they could be saying, there's a formal tactic that we can use. We just introduce a point at future infinity when all of the opportunities to contribute to totality have been resolved. So this is what it looks like in space-time. Here's the world line of an object. We just introduce, and here's kind of, it goes off into infinity. We introduce a point at future infinity. Okay. That sort of represents the end. That's the point at which all opportunities have been resolved. This sort of tactic is not uncommon in physical contexts. It doesn't mean that we have to countenance the existence of actual infinities. It just recognizes that totality facts become determinate when the universe is complete, and that the universe has no intrinsic maxima. Okay. That should seem intuitively right to you, as capturing at least the meaning of a totality claim. when we use it in this kind of physically all-inclusive way. Totality is what there is at the end of the day, when all is said and done. It is, in a world with no intrinsic maxima, an essentially open-ended concept. Since totality is never achieved, that is, never in the internal timeline of our world, totality facts are never yet fixed. Now, one sign that that's on the right track is that the paradoxes go away. There is no question about reality itself being inconsistent. The master argument, right, was that we can't give a complete and consistent explicit specification of the totality of local matters of particular fact from within the universe by putting the point of completion at future infinity, right? The point at which the totality fact is fixed and all of the facts can be explicitly made and accounted for. We remove the expectation that we should be able to give a complete and consistent explicit specification from within the universe while it's ongoing. What's really going on with the paradoxes is that they expose an instability in supposing that there is a concept with a well-defined extension before those opportunities have been resolved. Sort of jumping the gun and trying to fix it in advance will be self-defeating in something like the way that a child who's trying to guess his Christmas present is self-defeating. So he wakes up every morning from November through Christmas with a new guess for his mom about what his Christmas present is. So he says, it's a Y on one morning. The next morning says, it's an X, right? There's no way he's going to get the answer right. Why? Because if she wants it to be a surprise, his mother's just going to wait until Christmas Eve to buy something he hasn't already guessed. Okay? So just as for the child, there's negative interference between what he guesses and what she buys. No matter what he asks, she's going to buy something else. The paradoxical question is set up to create negative interference between what the device writes down and what the correct answer is. No matter what it writes down, the opposite is going to be true because it's going to be making the opposite true. Okay. But the argument only works for an oracle that is part of the totality that it's describing, because it hinges on logical interference between what it's doing and what it's saying. Okay. Of course, we are part of our world, so it works for us. We won't be able to give a complete and consistent specification of the totality of local matters of particular fact. Similar arguments arise, of course, for totality of all truths or a universal set. Any attempt to specify genuinely all-encompassing totality will include itself, and that will give us the means to fashion a paradox. Okay. To be, to exist, to be part of totality makes it impossible to grasp reality as a whole, to get your mind around the universe fully and explicitly. Okay. So it sounds grandiose when it's put that way, but it really comes down to not being able to stabilize the universe, conceived as the totality of local matters of particular fact, as an object of thought or reference, completely and explicitly and consistently, insofar as your own actions, including your attempts to specify it, are included. The attempt to explicitly specify totality in practice, of course, doesn't succeed for all kinds of much more mundane reasons than this, but it does show that the limitations on our ability to specify totality are not purely mundane. Okay. There's a deep and insuperable reason that totality, or being as such, right, has to be an open-ended concept for us. The universe is for us essentially incomplete, not just unspecified, but unspecifiable. Okay, so what does this mean for the human? I think that it means, or I worry that it means, that there is no determinate totality that is the Human Mosaic. The only consistent concept of totality that we can have is open-ended. The Human Mosaic will become a determinate totality. There will be a fact for any event E about whether or not E belongs to the Human Mosaic. The concept of the Human Mosaic will acquire a determinate extension at the point of completion. But that's a point for us that's never yet here. And while we can imagine that our knowledge of local matters of particular fact increases steadily over time, without intrinsic maxima, global properties of the Human Mosaic remain completely and utterly indeterminate. So it's tempting to put this by saying, as I did in an earlier argument, that uncertainty about the global properties is infinite and undiminishing. Okay, for agents, that is, whose knowledge of the world is knowledge by way of accumulation of local matters of particular fact. Okay. But uncertainty isn't actually the right notion here. It's something more insidious, I think. The situation is more like this. Suppose someone gives you a string of numbers and tells you this is a segment of an indefinitely extendable string. They tell you there are no connections among the elements. Each is independent of the others. And then they ask you, what's the sum of the string, the whole string? You should be going, what? So there are various things that you might try to make sense of the question. You could ask if there's a rule for generating the string, some finite effective procedure, for example, for determining that the nth member of the string. If there is, then you might look at whether the string converges, or you might even be more permissive than this. You might think it doesn't really need to converge. If there's a finite effective procedure for generating the string, then there's a well-defined fact about what the string is. So the sum exists, even if it's not something I could know. In the analogous situation for the Human Mosaic, there is provably no finite effective procedure for determining membership in the relevant totality. And it doesn't matter how long you wait and how many numbers or local matters of particular fact your interlocutor adds. All you ever have is an initial segment of an indefinitely extendable string for which there's effectively a positive test for inclusion, but no negative test. You can wait as long as you want. You'll never know for sure whether some element is or is not part of the string. Okay? And the problem here, I think, the right thing I think to say about it is the string does not pick out a well-defined object. Okay? And if that's right, there is no such thing as the sum. That's what I think one should say. I'm not sure though. Right? I do think that whatever you say about the string here, that's what you should say about the Human Mosaic. And whatever you say about the sum of the whole is what you should say about the laws and the chances on a Human account. For humans, it's doing this again, it's not advancing. For humans, laws and chances are shadows of the whole mosaic. They become definite when the mosaic is complete and a global assessment of simplicity and fit is made. That is humanism on the canonical account. I think of them sort of like words. You might know what the first 3 letters or 4 letters of a word are. But until that last letter is in place, you really don't have any idea what the word is. Is it fearlessness? Is it fealty? Is it feather bedding? Is it feasting? How the word is completed matters a lot. Later letters can completely change the meaning of the word. The defining metaphysical doctrine of humanism is, of course, that the elements in the mosaic are unconnected. And if it's indefinitely extendable, indeed indefinitely extendable along every dimension, it doesn't matter how much information we acquire about local matters of individual particular fact. Properties like best overall balance of simplicity and fit will be as out of reach, as utterly indeterminate as the sum of the whole string in the example is. So although I've spoken in places of concepts and extension, in some ways I'd rather kind of sidestep the philosophy of language issues, right? And just lean more heavily on the mathematical analogy to characterize what the situation seems to be like for the Human Mosaic. Let me say a little bit about cosmology, because I think, am I freezing? Can people still see me? Okay. Because I think that the contrast is helpful. So cosmology is where most of our positive ideas about the universe come from. And I said above that there's nothing wrong with exploring solutions to the field equations or other models of physical totalities. But of course, not all of cosmology is just exploring solutions to the field equations. There is also what's known as the standard model of cosmology, which is supposed to be explicitly a model of our universe as a whole. So most people have encountered this image in one form or another. It's a lower dimensional image of a four-dimensional space with time as the dimension that's represented. When the spatial dimensions is suppressed, time is represented by the vertical dimension along the bottom. So time is running along the bottom here. This big bright spot here is the Big Bang, and the increasing volume of these spatial slices is supposed to represent the expansion of space. The universe as represented in this image has clear boundaries and perfectly determinate global properties. So where does the image come from? Right? Well, we start, as we do in filling out the Human Mosaic, with actual observations. And there's one particular body of data, the cosmic microwave background, the CMB, discovered in 1964, which is radiation hitting the Earth from every direction in the universe, thought to be the residual heat of creation. That turns out to be particularly significant. So we take that body of data, we make some empirically unsupported and audacious assumptions about how the relatively small patch of the universe that we have observational access to relates to the rest. So we assume that the universe at large scale is homogeneous and isotropic, that it looks pretty much the same in a coarse-grained way in every part, in every direction. And then we use the laws to make inferences, okay? Venturing further conjectures where we don't have data. So that's where the standard model comes from, a good dose, so a bit of data, a good dose of conjecture, and the laws. The important part of this, though, is the order of determination. In cosmology, ideas about totality are derivative of our ideas about the laws. Humans have data too, and obviously they can make conjectures, but without the laws, the CMB is really just a faint glow of light in the night sky. It holds no implications for the large-scale structure of the universe. It's the laws that let us extract information from observations and arrive at ideas about the large-scale structure of the universe. For humans, it's the global properties of the mosaic that determine the laws. So they can't use the laws to give content to those global properties. The mosaic has to stand on its own because everything rests on it. So what might a human do? Notice that the difficulties here really attach to the best systems analysis, which ties truth conditions for the laws and the chances to the total mosaic. Okay. one might reject or modify the best systems analysis in a way that preserves the heart of humanism, at least insofar as that is about thinking of the laws and the chances as products of systematization, tools of prognostication for limited creatures. That's how I would do it. Here's how I would do it more specifically. Stop looking for a metaphysical reduction. Keep the modal connection at the level of ideas, which was Hume's original kind of intuition. Necessary connections aren't connections among local matters of particular fact. They're connections among our representations of local matters of particular fact. But recognize that our ideas about the universe are modal through and through, in part because the universe has this kind of essential openness for us. Beliefs about laws and chances are products of systematization, but they're aren't products of systematization of the whole mosaic, but of the past. And systematization, moreover, is more about induction than it is about informational compression, which is what's emphasized in the canonical formulation of the BSA, best systems analysis. Okay, now that will work for the metaphysically meek, that is, the lambs among us, whose humanism is motivated by resistance to reifying modal connections. Okay. There are others, however, for whom the heart of humanism is a metaphysical program that treats the human mosaic as some definite totality of events and seeks to give explicit reductions in terms of patterns in the human mosaic. Okay. So I'm particularly interested in seeing what those committed to this kind of program will say. Humans, I think, have always been a kind of uneasy alliance of those opposed to metaphysics on the one hand, and the hardcore metaphysicians on the other. So many of us, and I say us because I take it that's at least one of the motivations for the conference by the organizers of the conference. Many of us were attracted because of its opposition to metaphysical excesses of people like Armstrong and Thule. Right? But of course, it's a metaphysical program with equal in ambition and grandeur. And it became the dominant research program in metaphysics for a lot of lion-hearted metaphysicians. Okay. And I think this may be just the thing that separates the lions from the lambs. The imaginative picture of the sort of God's eye view has deep roots in us. And humanism, I think, is particularly heavily invested in it. Humanism, at least for the kind of the lion-hearted metaphysician. We all instinctively kind of ascend to this transcendent perspective when we think about the universe. And we imagine that there is some particular totality of events that we can refer to as though it were a determinate object. But I have come at least to think that there is not. The hard, or there is not yet, or not already, or not in a way that determinately makes sense in our mouths. The hard and incontrovertible nugget of truth at the center of what I've said, I think, is that totality for us is not just unspecified, but unspecifiable. And it's not for weird, logical, glitchy reasons. Okay? I think that it contains a deep truth about what it means to exist. What it means to exist or to be part of the universe is that the universe isn't there to be known for you as an object, like a table or a chair. The universe is being made to be known in part by you yourself acting as you do. The universe isn't complete until every tile in the human mosaic is filled in, and the potential for negative interference isn't abated until the end. And that means that to be consistent, we should replace the God's eye view with a point at future infinity and treat the concept of the universe as an essentially open-ended thing, like the child's Christmas present or the to be determined speaker slot at a conference, something that will acquire an extension in the future. I myself am fine with the idea that reality or being as such is what there will have been at the end of the day. I'm fine with the idea that the universe is perpetually ongoing and incomplete, if that is perpetually means at every point in the internal timeline in the world. And what else could it mean? Right? That strikes me as almost a tautology. I think one can embrace this and preserve the kind of metaphysically meek, pragmatically motivated heart of humanism, but I don't think that the lion-hearted concede so easily.